So welcome indeed to Fowler and the Garden Trust's bevy of talks. So we're on the final chapter of our tour around different types of landscapes and gardens added to the Historic England Register in 2020. And we're now reveling in the private gardens. And it's not surprising that this is proving to be the most popular section of the series. In this section, we've heard about plantswoman Beth Chatto, and last week Joyce Robinson and John Brooks and the development of Denman's garden. I think yet another example of a garden almost lost to the UK. So this week we will hear about the Spencer family and the garden they made in Leeds. Our objective with these talks is to raise awareness about the work, the ideas and the thinking of the original designers and gardeners and things, and also how these sites are now looking, to see what we can learn from this and take forward, to find out more about where the relevant archives are, and also what makes these places still so very special. And this week we're delighted to have Ben Preston and Meg Morton speak. So Ben has been head gardener at York Gate for 4 years. He studied horticulture and plant science at Nottingham Trent University, undertook a traineeship at Audley End in Essex, and has worked in gardens around the country, including Great Dixter. And now he's returned to Yorkshire. He says it is his interest in historic gardens and innovative plant design that is pushing the York Gate gardens forwards. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much. Well, this is a completely new talk, and I've pulled together the history from the start of the garden to present day. So I'm going to be chopping backwards and forwards from old photos to brand new photos and giving you a before and after. I think this grade 2 listing for me is a very, very important part of York Gate's history. The garden's in its 71st year this year, and making it 70 in its 71st year. And I was delighted to be alongside the likes of Denman's and Beth Chatto's. I'm a huge fan of Beth Chatto's work, and I think really we'll talk about Sybil Spencer first. She's a real unsung hero in British horticulture. We all know who Beth Chatto is. We all know John Brooks is. But the Spencer family were so innovative in their time, and this is actually a very recent photo as you come through the front gate, and this was taken in 2020. So it's a recent photo, but we're going to whisk you back to 1951, where it all started. And it was a farm. It was a 6-acre farm, and they weren't gardeners. The husband Fred and the son Robin were surveyors, and Sybil was. They kept animals. They bought this small holding for keeping their horses and chicken and ducks and pigs, and they quickly fell in love with building a garden, and they took inspiration from the Hidcotes and the Kiffskates, and a lot of people refer to this garden as mini Hidcote. I'm just going to go back one slide to show you that the difference between this photo from 1951 to present day. So we're looking at a slightly different angle, and I think one reason why this garden has got a list and why it's so special is because of the age that it's at. And 70 years for a garden is a ripe age, but not too mature. I remember going to Iford Manor a number of years ago, that's just over 100 years old now. And a lot of the trees have matured, and some of the shrubs have outgrown their space, and major renovation work has needed to be taken on. This garden is in its absolute prime. The hedging, the trees have reached maturity, but they've not outgrown their space. And it makes this garden, it's almost at a level of completeness, although a garden is never complete. So this is back to 1951. And this is the wonderful Sybil Spencer. And no matter if I'm giving a talk on modern day York Gate or York Gate through the history, and this is my favourite photo, and this is Sybil sat outside the front of the house, and big smile on the face. And Sybil bequests York Gate to the Gardeners' Charity in 1994 on her death in her 80s. And I think that also is a significant year for the garden in terms of history. And many gardens get left to National Trust or English Heritage. York Gate's a much smaller animal, and a wonderful one at that. And Sybil really started off something completely new that's going to be embedded into the British garden history. And formerly the Royal Gardens Benevolent Society, which is now 185 years old, 186 years old this year, is now called Perennial. And so the best way to describe Perennial is if the RHS look after the plants, then Perennial look after the people. And this garden was the first one that was bequeathed and gave a different angle to the charity. And it's somewhere where the charity's work can be shared, and that everyday gardeners like you and I know about the charity, and it's become the flagship for the charity. And since then, Sir Roy Strong's left the Lasket down in Hereford, and Bernard Tickner in 2017 bequeathed Fuller's Mill in Suffolk. So it started off this way. So it's a very, very important garden for me, and being a Yorkshireman, it's very close to my heart. Another handsome Yorkshireman, Frederick Spencer, and Fred was the one that bought Yorkgate in 1951 for him and Sybil, and their son was 17 at the time. This is a dashing photo of Robin Spencer. Fred was owned, well, he was a co-owner in Spencer and Gilpin, Spencer Gilpin and Sons, which was a surveying firm in Leeds, and Robin became a surveyor as well. And you'll see through the slides in the talk that there's many artifacts, ornaments, objects that they've collected as part of their work as surveyors. And I think if you were to collect these pieces now, for instance, millstones, it would be very, very expensive. So they were well before their time, and I think it makes the garden quite timeless. So that's the Spencers. So they moved in 1951. Actually, they didn't move in 1951, they moved in a year later. And for the very reason was that you can see the stone mullions in between the windows on the house. Sybil refused to move in until the stone mullions were removed. And actually the roof there, although it's black and white, was a slate roof. She didn't like the slate roof, so it was replaced with stone. But that was reclaimed. The slate roof was used in various parts of the garden, and that very much fits into the theme of the garden, arts and crafts. This is looking on we're looking at 45-degree angle away from the garden, away from the house. And this is where the magic of the garden starts. And I think the simplicity in this and the next slide that you'll see, and the juxtaposition between the evergreen structure and the garden, is why this garden's been listed. And this is just before the clouds broke in 2018, which was my second summer at Yorkgate. We'd had an amazing summer of sun, and this was the night before the clouds broke. And you can see, I'm just going to go backwards and show you that original photo. So the garden's evolved, and this is a garden at maturity. Something so simple as the juxtaposition between the Yucca gloriosa there and the Irish yew buns is very special. And you can look at this photo anytime, look at this view at any time of year, and the backbone and that structure, the evergreen structure of the garden is phenomenal. 12 months a year garden, and you've got the wonderful features like the weeping sequoia dendron there. That's reaching about 50 years of maturity. It's a fantastic plant and gives this sort of architectural character to that's very much part of the garden. And this is also embedded into the Yorkgate history now. I think it was 7 years ago, Yorkgate secured a heritage lottery funding that brought all the work of the Spencers documented. This is a drawing from Robin Spencer. He took it from a design in a maze in Huntingdon near Cambridgeshire, and we've got many of these photos in the archives that were hand drawn by Robin. Obviously, he was trained in technical drawing, and it sort of fits together. And the wonderful heritage team, which Meg's also a part of, is documented everything, the photos, the diaries of Fred Spencer in the war, Robin's drawings, and documented really. And then there was a wonderful oral histories project that took rather than just the written history, went out and found out about the people that knew the Spencers and that had visited the garden since it was open, right through the 60s and 70s. So it's very, very special. And I think because the garden's not hundreds of years old, the history has been kept, and and it's been well documented, and it's been archived by our wonderful heritage team. So it'd be great to see how the garden evolves over the next 50, 60 years, and that we can go right back to the very beginning of when these photos and designs were created. And this was done in 1978, and this is a blueprint done by Robin. And this is just 1 acre, and I think that's the one thing when I show you the slides going forward is it is a small English garden. In the 80s, it was said to be one of the best small gardens in the world, and I still think it is. The complexity of it. We were just looking the view to the house there. You can see we were in the bottom left-hand corner, looking back towards the house, and the garden takes you round, and there's various features and all. This master plan was laid out by Fred, and it was a triple partnership between Sybil, Fred, and Robin, creating this lovely garden. And unfortunately, Fred passed away just 12 years after buying Yorkgate in 1963, in his 50s. And this is a hereditary heart defect. So Robin took on the mantle of being the man of the garden, and together Sybil and Robin created. So we really say that Fred Spencer laid down the bones of the garden. He laid out the garden rooms and the paths, and then Robin built on that work and added the features. He designed the gates, and as you can see, the pavement maze. And Sybil was really the plantswoman that put all the pieces together. And anything on what that they saw on their travels, I think you can see the canal there. That was originally taken on from a design from the moon pool that Hidka. So they've pulled bits out of the arts and crafts movement, and it's known as an arts and crafts garden. But in truth, it's an arts and crafts style garden because of its creation in the 1950s rather than the turn of the century. It's an arts and crafts style garden rather than a true arts and crafts garden. But when you visit it, it very much encapsulates that movement and everything about it. Probably one of the most iconic views at Yorkgate. This is the herb garden, and putting this talk together has been quite inspiring of starting a garden from scratch. And the next slide is actually taken from the other direction. The summer house that you can see, the 2 columns here. I'm studying. Clive Nichols was studying the summer house, taking the photo down the garden. This is the view when the hedges were first planted, and the view beyond. That view beyond now has got a woodland that many people think is an ancient woodland. It certainly is not. It's only 50, 60 years old, but this is a view, and that's now a golf course. But these hedges have grown up and they've matured, and they've since been renovated twice. And where that bench is now where that summer house sits. So we're looking back down. So it's quite amazing to see how something can change, and the compartmentalisation of the garden and that use of the acre, and pulling that all together. Absolutely remarkable. And this is the view in the 70s. They obviously used to host in the summer house, and so Fred actually designed the summer house, and unfortunately he passed away before it could be built. And Robin carried on his work and built that, and it really is the love that they had for each other that created this amazing garden. And just the modernisation and the planting, and I think that's where we see our role as custodians now, is the backbone of the garden, the topia pieces, and the structures are very much Yorkgate's legacy and the Spencers' legacy. But the bits in between, the frothy lines and the underplanting, the herbaceous planting, it's something we can very much improve and draw on and use new plants. The Spencers were so innovative in using, I mean, Robin Spencer was growing aracemas in the 70s when people didn't know what aracemas were in the 70s. And we will continue to use new plants and new cultivars, and gardening the spirit of the Spencers and using new and exciting plants. But the backbone and the character of the legacy stays intact. And I've been constructing a conservation management plan that will protect that and encapsulate what the Spencers' legacy is and was. Another amazing view. This is actually what we now know as the White Garden. And again, I think the interesting thing is now we protect the very structure that is each of the rooms. But before, the Spencers, they weren't scared to change things. And I think that's how the great gardens develop. And rather than this garden having, although we saw the master plan from 1978 that Robin drew, before then, the garden was put together very piecemeal. And because they weren't professional gardeners and designers, they were just very, very hands-on and had an eye for detail. It developed into this herbaceous border on the left and then a white border on the right, and the sundial was popped in. It was carved by a local stonemason, and the actually is very accurate. Within 20 minutes is the sundial there. We call it the wonky sundial. And they create this ha-ha, and you can see now how the landscape has changed in the distance, and you can just see the tops of the trees there. And now it's a white garden, and they built on that. So they've changed from it. It was originally a herbaceous border with cold frames on the right-hand side. And you can see how the maturity of the gardens come to fruition. I think it's also worth noting his gardens still change and still develop, and the beech tree on the back left there, the weeping beech, that came down in a storm in December, completely changing this picture that we see. And I think for me as a gardener and a custodian of the garden, it's very important that we recognise the history of the garden, but also keep striding forward. And that space that it's opened up will be something new. And like the Spencers, it would be something completely new, and they would find new ideas and draw inspiration. And I think moving from a private garden that was open, they were opening for the NGS a couple of days in the summer, to a garden now that opens from the 1st of April to the end of October. There's different strains on the garden. There's different pinch points. There's also a need for constant succession planting in colours, and really themed in family gardens, themed rooms they might have had a season, it might have been a spring garden or a summer garden, but now with the footfall, the gardens had to evolve. So there's many factors that affect the running of a historic garden like this, and I think we do it in a very sensitive way, but also a very intelligent way in terms of the way that the planting design has been developed. And this is a view back towards the house. And they've made subtle changes. I think one interesting thing to note is, and very much like the work of Beth Chatto, is it was all about the garden. It's not like the Great Dixters with the fancy houses and the Sissinghurst, where the house is as grand as the garden. The house is a lovely stone Yorkshire farmhouse, but they really were interested in spending all their time in the garden. It's very modest. They had lovely furniture and things, but really the history is in the garden, not in the property. And here we go. These are the millstones that they collected, and from coming in the front gate, there must be 30 or 40 millstones and grindstones throughout the garden, and they were collected at local mills from sort of Shipley, Bradford, and there's a big history of milling of all different types and a history in Yorkshire. And they collected these, and we actually, in the new garden, which I'll show you later on in the slide, we had to pay an extortionate amount of money to get a millstone off a farm up in the Dales, but they were very much collecting these throughout their travels and works, and it's created something that's very, very timeless. And these repeating hard landscaping features through the garden are something that will be there. These grindstones will be there in another 1,000 years if they're left. So very, very timeless. More structures in the garden. This is what we call the folly with cedar shingles, and it very much is in the centre of the garden. And you can see, the interesting thing for me is seeing these trees behind us. You've got the silver birch there, that's no longer there, and really that actually the garden is only 70 years old and it's matured immeasurably. This is the folly from the other side, and this garden's gone through transformation after transformation, and this is what we call the dell, and it goes through the biggest change in the seasons. It's other than the Cunninghamia there, the fir in the middle, it's completely deciduous. So it takes up all the light. There's a huge carpet of snowdrops in here in February, and then it starts to unfurl wonderful woodland trees, Echinopsis and Trilliums. And this is a bit further back, and you can see how much less canopy there was around, and this obviously a few years after its creation. and lupins. And if you look past the dog there, there's a wonderful bearded iris border. Well, as wonderful as an iris border is, the garden's evolved and changed because irises will only flower for 2-3 weeks at the end of May, early June, and then they're done for the year, which is no good for a garden. So to the public, and I think a few head gardens ago, the decision was made to change it. I'm going to go forward a few slides. I'm going to come back. So this is now the border. We've still got lupins. We still take a little piece of the history and pop that back in, but the garden's evolved. And the carpet path there, we didn't have a clue where the original plan was for the carpet path. And we had a little slot on Gardens World 3 years ago in February. And a chap brought in a book that was published in 1970. The carpet path was built in 1971. And it was a book of Japanese, it's a black and white book of Japanese garden design. And the garden's it's not known as a Japanese garden, but actually when you strip it back, there's some very Japanese elements. And this exact design for the carpet path was on the center fold of the book. And in the inside cover of the book was Robin Spencer's initials. This chap had bought this book for a few pounds in a charity shop in York some 25 years ago. And it was lost to the archives of a charity shop, and this chap brought it in, and we've now got the book that shows us these. And I think one thing to note from that is that no ideas are completely new. All these gardens that we see from the arts and crafts movement, and then later on from styled garden like this, is we take ideas from other gardens and other bits of architecture, like the pavement maze from Huntingdon, and we merge them together and we create something that's completely new, it's rebirth. It has a rebirth, and like the iris border before, the black grass, it's a perfect edging plant for this path. It shows off the path, but it also creates an evergreen barrier. So it's working with the history and the evolution, and there's many different factors that keep on bringing this garden forward and maturing the garden. And the Spencers got the ball rolling, and it's their design, and then many gardens have sculpted this, and every head gardener that looks after the keys adds their little bit, and also the many volunteers. Meg's been gardening at Yorkgate as a volunteer for over 15 years, and has seen a few head gardens now, and it's testament to people like Meg that have been there for so long, that their input in the garden and their acceptance of the change is very, very important. And rather than the 3 Spencers that created the garden, there's many, many more inputs, and having open conversations about the future of the garden, the way things change, sculpts the garden and makes it even better. And again, simple planting design. This is the same border 3 months later. The white lictus coming to flower, and the lilies and the salvia amis that gets dropped in. But yeah, really, really amazing from this photo in the 70s. So really, really special how this garden's developed. And this is another picture. We looked at the folly when it's first being built, and now it's weathered. The roof is still exactly the same. The ball has fallen off the top. The uprights have been replaced a couple of times. They're now pine uprights, but the roof is still the same, and that'll need replacing in probably in the next 10 years. But that history is still there, and it's very much suspense. Another little look at the hard landscaping, and this is the view from above, and you can see the bottom corner of the canal there. But you strip all the planting layers away, and that backbone that the Spencers laid out is very much the heart of the garden. There's the dog again, and another. You can see there from the first view that we've seen, the plantings evolved again, and also things like the circular window. Unfortunately, I've not got a picture from that window. You'll have to come visit the garden, but that's Sybil's potting shed, and it looks back down the garden on the central axes, and the axes are very important in this garden. There's axes that cut from northeast to southwest, and on the other axes, and because the garden's so small, it makes these sort of vistas that cross the garden make the garden feel much bigger than it is. And we saw the picture of the herb garden earlier with the Picea in the background, these sightlands, and garden designers still use these principles today, using focal points and trees or statues at the end of vistas to draw your eye, making spaces feel much bigger than they are. And this is back down to the dell, and this is coming away from the background of the history is the plants. And that's what the next layer of this garden is. It's the real amazing woodland plants down in the dell. We've got trilliums here that have been in for years and years. Glaucidium palmatum. This is a wonderful plant from Hokkaido in northern Japan that takes 7 years to flower from seed. And these treasures are absolutely, they bring this garden to life in late April, early May. And before that canopy comes on in the dell, these woodland trees take over. Meconopsis, primulas. We've got a whole host of candelabra primulas. This is Miller's Crimson, and there's Bulliana, and Florindi follows. And it's amazing the mix of North American woodland plants and Himalayan woodland plants, Japanese woodland plants. Really, plants that have evolved in a similar climate, but from different parts of the world, are brought together and makes it magical. And this is that same space just a few months later. We looked at the photo earlier, the back of the folly, where there was no leaves on the trees. You can see the Cunninghamia in the middle there with the dark stem. It's about using the garden as almost as theatre. And once that woodland layer, you can just see the primula Bulliana with the yellow flower spike just above the Machusias. The garden evolves again, and it evolves with the plants rather than the hard landscaping, and they very much work together. It's theatre, it's gardening theatre through the seasons, and the textures take over the colours. And this is that view that we were saying, looking back down. So once that summer layer of textures, the autumn colour takes over, and the Acer aconitifolium there that's in full red leaf is a wonderful, wonderful plant. So one of the features, back to Robin's drawings. Robin really was, these sketches that are modern sketches were the foundations of some of the great features in the garden. And this urn, when I show you the next picture, this urn is not actually there. This is now a gate. Taking a very, very simple traditional British coppicing technique. These are hazel, and these are filberts and cobnuts. There's 12 different filberts and cobnuts, which creates a hazel walk. And like many of the woodlands are managed, that are coops that are coppice stools of sweet chestnut down in the south of the country and hazel further up north. These you can see on the outside of the main uprights, the new leaders that are going to be trained in. And this is the design that can be created in anybody's garden. And I think people that come and visit the garden relate to this garden because of these features. The Chatsworths and the Castle Howards and the Dixters, they're not feasible to you and I. They're not normal sized gardens. They're from vast wealth. But the Spencers created what was originally a modest garden in a small garden, taking traditional features like this and making it into something wonderful. So simple nut walk, and every year I get excited about the nut walk unfurling, and it starts off with the snowdrops. And I think little slice of history like this, Sybil Spencer bought 3 snowdrop bulbs that were Galanthus S. Armour in 1960, 3 and 6pence, which I'm sure some of you will be able to work out what that was. And my father did tell me, I think it was 17.5p. Something like an old money. So from just 3 Galanthus S. Armour, there is tens and tens of thousands that have been lifted and divided and split, and they run under this wonderful nut walk, and then they're followed by Tulipa praesens fusilea, which is a wonderful species tulip. And I think taking such a simple feature as coppiced hazel, train them in an arch, and then underplanting them with a succession of planting, is genius, but so simple and so clever. And that's the bits of inspiration that people come away with from Yorkgate, and why it resonates with people so much. You can't recreate the whole garden, but you can definitely recreate some things. And this is it when it went in. These were the young hazels that were put in on bamboo canes, and now they create the wonderful arch that is there today. And you can see again into the background there, you cannot see the hills anymore. The trees have covered the land. So a little bit of a view back, and we looked at the herb garden, which is in the very centre of the photo there. And the herb garden was to the left. This just showed you how the garden and the hedges lay out. And there were some 500 hedging plants that were put around the border of the garden, and then there was 70 yews planted in parallel lines for the herb garden. And I don't know if the Spencers knew how this garden would develop. And I think, like many garden designers that have left these wonderful legacies, I think it's very nostalgic for us to think of gardens evolving how they planned it, but gardens evolve quite organically, and they're sculpted by every gardener and every pair of hands that comes through them. I think that's the wonderful thing about gardens. And simple things. This is in the veg garden in the 70s, and this is last year. The Irish yew, and then the new features. It's been, the arts and crafts has been brought into that. It was bare, they laid the flags down, and then they built on that, and they've got this lovely, the features have been built, and the copper kettles and the oak uprights and the old railway benches that's leaned up there. And it's this collection of materials and ornaments that make it so true to the arts and crafts type. This is a different angle, and it still uses a veg garden today. The lettuce is still growing there, and then we grow annuals in there and cut flowers, and this is early in the year, and then it evolves to this. And this is where the influences come in from the Dixters and the Hidcots and the Kidsgates. And I think it's worth noting that, I mean, I've spent lots of time at Great Dixter and I'm incredibly inspired by it, but in our archives, we have letters from Robin Spencer to Christopher Lloyd, and we've got letters from Sybil Spencer to Marjorie Fish. So they were very much embedded in that wonderful garden culture in the 60s and 70s. Like we are now, I think that the exchanges that we have between the likes of, we still buy plants from Beth Chatto's, and I went down to Lambrook Manor to meet the new owners there. That was Marjorie Fish's garden, and some of the plants that were bought for Yorkgate in the 60s. It's very much ingrained, and it's amazing that the Spencers are sort of they're unsung heroes of the plant world. And when you move further up north, there's not as many gardens as there is in the south, but for me, it's just as important as all the great gardens in the south of England. And again, like these are very, very 70s gardens. They were very much of their time, but they evolved and they constantly moved and changed, and it became the paved garden. And then amazing things like the wonderful white table there. That white table is still in the flat where I live at Yorkgate. I didn't realise it was a £700 antique before I painted it green. It'll have to return back to white. But there's these wonderful things that you find out after it happened. And this again, the planting has changed immeasurably in this space. And this is modern day. Sybil's wonderful succulent greenhouse is still there. It's still loving and cared for. But the planting has been modernised. The framework and the beds are the same size. The stone's still in the same place, but we've used the aeoniums that were once planted in pots in the greenhouse are now planted in the ground. And we're moving forward with the cultural change of horticulture, but with the same plants and using them in a different way, but very much in the character of the Spencers. Very, very modern planting, agaves and grasses. There's a wonderful new Rebecca there, Prairie Glow, and Ionium Schwarzkopf that seems to be star of the show at flower shows these days. But yeah, so constant evolution. I couldn't do this talk without showing this wonderful, wonderful tree. And on the back wall there is Cedrus atlantica glauca. And as far as we know, there's no other specimen like this in Europe. And this is 60 years of dedicated training that's created what I believe is one of the greatest trained trees in the country. We've seen many espaliers, but this has been lovingly clipped for 60 years, and it's done once a year. It's done in the end of September, and it really just sets off the garden. This is looking down from the miniature pine Eton across the garden. These are the features why this garden's been listed. It was one of the great post-war gardens. 60 years, there is no amount of money in the world that can buy a tree like this. It has to be grown in situ and trained in situ. There's no plants that can be transplanted of this size. This is testament to an idea 60 years ago that has grown and been cultivated. And that's why gardens are so special, because sometimes you can have all the money in the world, but you cannot buy something like this. So magical tree for me. And this is a couple of our volunteers, Sarah and Sue, and one of our trainees, Andy. And it's a poignant time to mention the trainees and the volunteers in the garden. We have a 2-year traineeship, training young gardeners, and then we've got a humongous team of volunteers. Meg was one of the founders of the volunteers, and there was 16 garden volunteers, and there's 170 in total at the cafe and the shop. I'll let Meg talk a little bit more about that when I'm finished, but really important part of keeping this garden in tip-top condition. And again, a bit further back, you can see there how the trees have matured and just how the garden has been built decade on decade, and subtle changes that they've made. And you see the cobbles in the foreground here that are very white. These are the Scottish river cobbles. And again, there's some Japanese hints there with the negative space and the individual trees. But again, it's changed. And this is go back on slide, the clipped holly there that you see. This is from the other axis. This has completely changed. This is the modern day. The espalier to the left, and it's become more complete. The paving's been changed slightly. The pine Eton's been replanted twice. The Dowick beech has just seemed to have grown into a 40, 50-foot tree over the last 30 years. And I think it'd be very interesting to see this garden another 30 years when it's matured again. A little bit of a nod to the wider landscape. The garden is 1 acre, 14 different garden rooms, but there's more to Yorkgate. The further 6 acres, and these were the paddocks where the horses were grazed, and now it's become a traditional hay meadow, wildflower meadow. And when I started 4 years ago, it not been maintained as a meadow. It'd been cut, and there was various things that happened. One of the previous head gardens, Martin Walker, planted some lovely trees. But we've started managing it in a very traditional way, removing the hay. We've added yellow rattle. It was amazing to see some of the things that came back in the early years. And the pignut was already there, but it's increased in vast quantities, and it's often an indicator of ancient meadow is Conopodium major, this pignut. But the most significant bit is its host to the chimney sweeper moth, which is about the same size as your thumb. And the biodiversity in this meadow is overwhelming. There's thousands of these wonderful little chimney sweeper moths in the summer, in May when the pignut's in flower. And it just adds so much different, and that intensity of the garden, you can go out into the wider landscape at Yorkgate. It's not a huge area, it's 1.5 acres of meadow, but you can just relax and be part of nature, and where the fells that you saw, the hills that you saw in the early photos are now covered in trees. It's a lovely backdrop, and you get lovely little trees like this. Much to the disgust of some of the other gardeners, I make us hand side the meadow now, using traditional Austrian sides, and we can really get in touch with the plant densities and what's growing, and where improvement might need to be made, and where we might need to suppress the grass and sow more yellow rattle. It's a really great way, and it's a wonderful thing. I think it's a tradition that I believe should be preserved with English gardens. So that largely is the 1 acre, and you can see there from above the area where the cars are on the right hand side in that building. That area there is about 1/2 acre, and it was sold off in 1958. So the Spencers bought Yorkgate Farm just over 6.17 acres in 1951. In 1958, they needed a bit more money to build the garden, so they sold off that half an acre. And 8 years ago, Perennial were offered first refusal to buy it back. And what that did was it gave us access to protecting Yorkgate's future. When I started 4 years ago, there wasn't a car parking space. There was 17,000 visitors in my first season without one car parking space. And there's one thing that people need when they're visiting the garden: it's a cup of tea, a car parking space, somewhere to go to the toilet. And evolving from that front gate that we saw on the front slide, that is where people used to enter the garden. It was going to limit the garden's future. And this half an acre has now been brought back into the Perennial fold, and the Yorkgate original 6 acres. And it's actually, what it's done is it's protected that 1 acre gem. So the 1 acre that we're talking about that's hedged to the left, that is the garden that's got the grade 2 listing. The wider Yorkgate farm has not got the listing. It's all about that 1 acre. And this area on the right, I've been very privileged to be part of the redevelopment. That's an area that supports the garden. And this is the view back in the 50s, before they sold off the farm that was to the left, which I just showed you. And this was the house that I lived in before it was renovated. And it's gone through, in the last 2.5 years, it's gone through a serious transformation. And this is what you see today. This is a Mediterranean garden with a terrace and a cafe that supports the garden. And there was a small tea room in the downstairs of the house, but it very much impacted on the garden's visitor experience. So all the essential extras that you get with a garden, the gift shop, the cafe, the car park, the ticket office, we brought that out of the garden. So that Spencer's legacy, that 1 acre, is really, really protected, but it still needs to be funded. And the car park and the cafe and the shop really do that. And this is just a little bit of evolution. It's been a great project to be part of. And we've pushed the planting. We've tried new plants like the Spencer's wood and all the stones from 2 miles up the road from a local quarry. And these details are not by accident. These are details from the original garden, and that slate roof that I talked about at the start of the talk. The slate was used in steps, and these are the steps. This is a photo from the 80s. These are Lutching style steps. The idea was taken from the Lutching steps at Dixter. Robin drew a design and created these wonderful Lutching style steps with the slate from the roof, and then that's been taken across to the new design. So there's been thought of what the Spencers created, which goes back much further than the Spencers. It goes back to Lutchings and the great designers of the turn of the century. And I think for me, that's why this garden's got a wonderful place in British garden history. It's because of these details and this style of arts and crafts and it's the complexity of what the Spencers brought together, and now the many people's hands that have been over it. I'm going to take you back to the first slide, looking back to the front of the house, and I'll pass you over to Meg. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was just terrific, absolutely fantastic. My head's buzzing. But if we can go on to Meg. So Meg Morton is one of the volunteers at Yorkgate, and after a career in nursing, she trained in horticulture and plantsmanship at Bishop Burton College. And on her completion of the 2-year course, she made 2 decisions: to go into local garden rescue on a small scale with a friend, and, if allowed, to volunteer at Yorkgate, which she visited from college one afternoon in the early summer. Over to you, Meg.
Thank you very much. Right. Well, you asked me several questions, Annabelle, when you asked me to do this. I'm going to work my way through them. I haven't got any pictures to show. I'm just talking. Okay. You asked me what it's like gardening at Yorkgate. Oh, it's a joy, a real joy. The day I go there, which is Thursday, has been from the start a day I look forward to enormously. Usually we have no idea what we're going to be doing until we get there. And that's part of the pleasure. In the garden, we weed and we plant and we mulch and we deadhead and cut things back. Sometimes we often tidy up the garden for when the visitors are coming. Behind the scenes, we might be bagging up bulbs for sale or even chopping up unused poles to make bundles of kindling to sell in plant sales. Some days we do pretty mucky jobs outside the garden itself. We also set on projects such as clearing Himalayan balsam from the stream or encroaching brambles from the field. In the past, when the garden was not so generously staffed as it is now, we pitched in with jobs like building the greenhouse and the polytunnel, to much hilarity, I have to say. We don't really mind what we do because it's all to make the garden look its best or to help with the running of the place in some way. Oh, and we eat cake. I think I should add that another attraction for the volunteers is the free tea and delicious cake from the cafe at 3:30. Before we leave each time, we often stroll around the garden to soak up the atmosphere and breathe in the peace and beauty before we have to go. I'm going to quote from some of my fellow volunteers that I've asked to give me some extra bits to pad out what I got to say. As Margaret says, the volunteers are made to feel appreciated and welcome, to feel we make a difference. And we have made strong friendships through working there. Jo says, there's something very friendly about a shared enthusiasm. And volunteers' own ideas are sometimes used. I don't think actually Ben showed us this, but there are some wonderful photos of our tree ferns wearing their very snazzy coffee bean sack duffel coats to protect them in the winter, dreamt up and made by Sue, who's one of the Friday volunteers, to keep out the winter chills. Everyone who sees those loves them. As Diana has said, I have always felt it a privilege to work there, but then it's not really work, is it? From the time 15 years ago when we helped in the garden and greenhouse, washed the plant tables and made sure the boiler was on for serving up tea in plastic cups, to now, and the Yorkgate garden it has become, I've always felt proud to say, I help out there. I feel the same. Apart from volunteering in the garden, I also do several illustrated talks each year for local garden societies and other groups, with the aim of telling people about our charity, Perennial, and raising money for it, as well as encouraging them to come and see Yorkgate for themselves. As Ben said, there's a good handful of gardening volunteers, about 15 or 16, but there are about 170 other volunteers who work in the shop and the cafe and in admissions and in the plant centre and welcoming people when they come and organising the car parking. I feel we're let off very lightly, really. What we do, the work we do, is simply because we love doing it. And I think we're incredibly lucky to be able to do that. I think sometimes working in the cafe must be much, much harder than anything we have to do. Now, I was asked to choose my favourite bits of the garden. That's very difficult. I could say whichever part I'm working in at the time, but that wouldn't be quite true. As Janet, another of my fellow volunteers, has put it, that changes with the seasons. The dell in spring is full of hope and treasures. The white garden in summer is full to the brim and overflowing. And what could be better than sitting outside at the cafe overlooking the new Mediterranean garden on a sunny day? And I agree with that. The latest incarnation of Sybil's garden, with its tree ferns and gloriously rampant and colourful exotic plants, comes into its own in the summer. The herb garden has a classic feel to it, simple and formal in design, but increasingly exuberant as the year goes on. The paved garden has undergone several changes in its planting over the years, but for me, that's always been the corner where Sybil and Robin used to sit in the early evening with a drink, discussing their day and what had been happening in the garden. I wonder what ideas first emerged from those fertile minds in that spot. It's all beautiful and each area is special in its way. It's no good, I can't decide my favourite. You asked about sheltered areas in the garden. Yorkgate is on a gentle eastern-facing slope, which encourages the frost to roll down towards the dell and away. Most of the garden is sheltered from the prevailing west wind, partly by the buildings themselves, but also by yew and beech hedges. There are well-clipped yew hedges enclosing the herb garden with its topiary as well, and beeches used for this in the white and silver garden, the kitchen garden, Sybil's garden, and elsewhere. The iconic yew sails protecting the canal garden. The new plant sales area has some rather gorgeous new woven fencing in hazel and, I think, chestnut, made by Ben and the garden trainees to protect it. Something about the people who come to visit the garden. Well, we get all sorts. It's amazing how many visitors the garden can absorb without it feeling at all crowded. It helps, of course, having a booking in system now, so visitors are spaced out over the day. And I think Ben is hoping to keep that system going. It's worked so well. We find that they enjoy talking to the volunteers they come across as they explore the garden. Often people say how inspirational they found it there and how they found ideas they could use in their own gardens, because it isn't on a grand scale, so they can relate to it easily. They often ask about the plants and want to have names of any they don't recognize. If we're not in a position to go to them to have a look, we ask them to take a photo of it if they haven't already done so. One of the things that keeps people coming back is the knowledge that there'll always be something new. Recently, of course, that's including whole new garden areas, but also they may be surprised by new plantings in the older parts of the garden or changes made when something has had to go. It's lovely to see and hear children in the garden, many of whom come with their parents on repeat visits. We meet them working excitedly through a garden quiz they've been given in admissions. Visitors like hearing anecdotes about the Spencers, and they tell us if they have memories of them and of the garden from earlier years. For instance, one lady told me that Sybil Spencer used to keep ducks there, and it was one of her regular errands as a little girl to come and buy some duck eggs to take home. Many of their memories of the Spencers have been recorded for our heritage project, of which I was a small part. What drew me to volunteer here? Well, I first came to Yorkgate on a visit from college. I was doing a 2-year HNC course in horticulture and plantsmanship at Bishop Burton. During the second year, this was in the year 2000, we often visited gardens and sites of special horticultural interest, and Yorkgate was high on the list of priorities. Though I only lived 20 minutes drive away, I had, to my shame, never been there. I fell in love straight away, and soon after rang the garden administrator and begged to be allowed to volunteer work in the garden. I longed to be a part of it. At that time, I believe the only gardening volunteers were a handful of Sybil Spencer's friends, who still came in regularly to lend a hand. After several months, my wish was granted, and I started working there every Thursday, because that had been my college day. And I've been a Thursday girl ever since. I think that's 21 years, actually. Among my first jobs were gathering seeds from martagon lilies and taking cuttings from penstemons, with a remarkable lack of success, if I remember rightly. In those days, the garden was only open on Sundays, Thursdays, and bank holidays. We had our lunch break in the garage, in the winter sitting near a small electric heater. The visitors were served from there with coffee and tea and biscuits, and at the end of the day, the tea volunteers would tip out the remaining boiling water from the urn onto any dandelions trying to grow in the pavement maze. It's very different now when you get wonderful meals in the cafe. What is it about the garden that makes it a special place for me? Well, it's a very peaceful place, despite being close to a major city. No one shouts there. It's on a small scale, very intimate and restful, but also always slowly changing and developing, not only through the seasons, but as new ideas are tried out. And the different personalities working there bring their own ideas and work them into the existing framework of the garden. I think one of the things I love, and I know others feel the same, is that sense sometimes when you're on your own for a little while in some part of the garden, that it's some way it's yours and you belong there. I didn't know the Spencer family before they had died. Sadly not. I was living in the area before even Robin Spencer died in the 80s, let alone Sybil, who died in 1994. So I deeply regret not having woken up much earlier to the fact that this gorgeous garden was so close at hand. But I've been trying to make up for that ever since. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meg. That was lovely. Thank you for answering my questions. I'm gonna...
Sorry. Thank you, Ben, Meg. That was absolutely amazing. Time travel in gardens, fertile minds, a rich diet of horticulture. I shall have to go and lie down soon to recover from all that. I will, if you would both stay on, and we will see what we have in the chat to tax your minds.
My light, I look like a ghost.
I think you look wonderful, actually, very atmospheric. Annabelle has kicked off. She said, where were the Spencers living before York Gate? I must say, I was curious about that as well. Do you know anything about this and their gardening?
Go on, Meg.
Oh, they lived in Headingley on the outskirts of Leeds.
And did they have a garden?
Very small one, I should think. What do you think, Ben? Do you know?
Anybody who watches the house through history knows all about Headingley now. So gardens, I'm sure, did exist. Do you have any knowledge, Ben?
We know where they lived, and we know the house is now. It's very much similar stone to the York Gate house, but the garden was very modest. It was a terrace. It was a very small garden. So they didn't have any prior garden experience really. They wanted to keep animals, and then their love of gardening developed from there. So it's quite remarkable, really.
So they didn't move there. They moved there for the land around the fields and so forth, did they?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The first sort of decade, they had pigs and horses and go on, Meg.
Meg?
I was going to say, yes, they had a couple of horses, lovely, two lovely horses, but they needed to find grazing for, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.
And that came before, and they had pigs, didn't they? And ducks. That came before the garden.
Yes, I can understand. This chronology I find absolutely fascinating, and I'm sorry to bore you with a question of my own, but this constant change that Ben was illustrating, and obviously you do have an archive, but I just wondered how much of that archive is photographic, how much is plans and drawings, is it available? And Meg, you mentioned your heritage project. I'd be interested to hear more about that too, please.
The only bit I was personally involved in was the oral histories, going and recording people telling us about their memories, which was very interesting. But other people have for instance, have transcribed Fred's diaries that he wrote, which are still in existence, which are apparently wonderful. I've not read them yet.
And they are accessible to other people? I mean, is there...
I will send you a link. There's I'll have to email you a link on it. But we've now got a heritage website where all the photos and all the details. Fred's diary is not on there because obviously there's some personal things about his life. But there's lots of there's endless photos from the garden's creations, all Robin's drawings. It's if you type in York Gate Heritage Project, the website will come up. It's Google, or I'll send you the link. But all the artifacts and the slides that the Spencers took. And there's also just this week, somebody's transcribed. There was a talk that Sybil gave in the 70s, and the pictures have just been married to the words. And some of the pictures that I showed tonight were part of that talk. So yeah, all the project is fully accessible to everybody this evening and everybody worldwide.
Well, thank you. That's absolutely fabulous. I look forward to delving into that. Judy remarks it's interesting to reflect that the coterie of amateur gardeners of the 50s and 60s have led to the development of the great professional garden designers today. I don't know if you both see that link and feel that this is one of the stepping stones to the great British garden design profession.
It really is, and I think especially locally, first of all, in the 80s, there were many books of garden design that featured pictures of various features at York Gate with the vistas and the topiary, and the compartmentalised garden rooms. But still now, many local garden designers and courses and student groups, they'll come to Yorkgate specifically to look at the design. So yeah, it's had a huge influence, especially in the Leeds area and nationally, of small garden design, but very small, very clever small garden design.
It's quite a responsibility, I should think, isn't it?
Yeah.
The weight of that. The Mosaic Maestro of Ilkley, we're all dying to hear about this. Ben, don't forget to tell everyone about the brilliant shell work of David James.
So it's actually one of the few pieces that's post Spencer, and it was created in, I think it's about 6 years ago now. He's a mosaic artist from Ilkley, and it's a wonderful arrangement of. It's in the old Barrow store, and it's a wonderful arrangement of shells that's they're held on with copper roofing nails, and it's a lovely feature that I don't have a picture of it to show. You'll have to come to the garden and see, but it's one of the very few new features that have been added as a sort of a latest arts and crafts edition from the previous gardeners. Go on, Meg.
I think it also, doesn't it hark back to the two little shell pictures that Sybil had either made or had up in the potting shed where the shell feature is, which had fallen apart over the years. To me, they harked back to those.
Yeah, so it's taken inspiration from the smaller shell designs, and then that was commissioned by David James. So yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very interesting. Annabelle, do you want to ask your question? Do you want to come back in?
I was fascinated, Ben, by all the photos that you showed backwards and forwards, as Helen was saying, and also, I probably shouldn't say this. Also, like how our tastes have changed and how horrible some of the old planting was, and then I wondered if you could ever work on a sort of a pure restoration conservation project, with a planting, herbaceous planting, rather than shrubs and trees and things, that remained static. I didn't think that was part of your character.
I think it's an interesting thought, and I don't know. I think certainly with certain gardens of the National Trust and English Heritage, the gardens have to remain true to the era, and often they have to stick to strict planting plans, so only plants that were available at the time. And I think a personal view is that it's a short-sighted way of gardening. We should be true to the history and the legacy of a garden, but the plants have got better, plants are better, styles have changed, designs change, and it's about, I suppose it's like the whole, it's when people replace box hedging with different plants that are similar these days in a similar style, but it's still not, nothing's quite as good as box. I suppose that's reverse to what's happening now, is that we use plants that flower longer, better cultivars than, sometimes we replace like for like plants and species, but with better cultivars. So yeah, I think I agree. I think some of the tastes, I didn't show any pictures of the paved garden, which was actually Sybil's favourite garden. I mean, it was quite honestly ghastly. There were conifers and begonias and pot plants and heathers, and there was a complete jumble of styles and no real sort of cohesion. And I think now, with some of the new wave perennial movement, with ornamental grasses and flowering perennials, it's a bit more easy on the eye because it harks much more back to nature, and I think that's very reflective in modern garden design and styles of gardening.
Ben, could I pick up from you, Annabelle, and ask, is it mostly the planting that has, I love your word, modernised, has changed? Has the structure been modified enormously, or is that basically still the same? Yes and no. I can see a bubble coming out of your head.
Sorry, you want to answer that one, Meg?
Can you hear me?
Oh, I'll answer it. To be honest with you, the structure of the garden is largely the same. There's actually there was one garden where I didn't show the tree ferns because it's the only room that's been changed post Spencer. So it was the second vegetable garden, and it was when we were looking at the picture of this valley of cedar, it was the garden at the back. And it was second vegetable garden, and it was redesigned by Sybil, and then in 2003 it had a redesign by the landscape architect Alistair Baldwin, and that's the only structural change that's been made to the whole garden. All the paths, the structures, the buildings are all very true to the original Spencer legacy. So it's very we try and stay with the times by the underplanting rather than changing the structure. I think it's an important thing to keep is the layout. It works so well.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much. Meg, yes.
Can I say that one of the things, well, Mark, who's our nursery manager, was saying to me the other day that one of the things is people keep coming back because there's always something new to see, and because they don't know quite what they're going to see next time. Otherwise, if they'd seen it and it was being kept in one particular style and one particular planting or whatever, it'd be more or less been there, done that, and they wouldn't come back. Whereas people keep coming back all the time. We have lots of friends who, friends with a capital F, who just keep coming. And that's because they never know what they're going to see next.
Well, there's an interesting question here from Liz. I'm sorry to see that the nuttery I loved on my last visit a long while ago has gone. Why was that decision made, and what has replaced it? So maybe it's one friend who isn't coming back.
The nuttery's still there.
The nuttery's still there, is it?
The nut walk's it's bigger and more.
Liz, are you willing to unmask yourself and unmute and perhaps have a conversation about this? Would you rather not? Let's just see. Not the nut walk.
Not the nut walk. I don't.
Something different.
To my knowledge, I don't know about you, Meg, but the only area with the nuttery was the nut walk, which had the filberts on it. So I don't know.
I don't think there was any other nut area, as far as I know. Certainly not in
the last 20 years.
No.
I think this is a conversation you may have to have by email when we finish. This sounds very, very interesting. Annabelle has also asked, what is the sawtooth hedge in the photo on the right-hand side? The photo on the right-hand side of this photo.
What's the what, sorry?
The sawtooth hedge in the photo.
So that was a feature that is in the centre of the garden. They're the yew sails. It's there's seven different yew of the six yew sails. There's 2 rows, but they're clipped once a year, and they're wonderful. They were originally shot 8 foot, and now they're about 20 foot. But yeah, it's just a common old garden yew.
Thank you very much. We're beginning to lose you a little bit, Ben. So I suggest that if Liz Dobson would like to contact you individually at another time, that would be good. But perhaps I should pass back to Annabelle now, if you're there, Annabelle, to draw things to a close. Is that all right?
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you very much for doing all the questions. Thank you very much for answering all the questions. Thank you both. That was fantastic. Really brilliant. Completely different from any other talk we've had. I think the subject is very different. I think your approach has been very different as well. And I think your access to all that information, Ben, that the family left and that other people have generated since, from oral history projects and all the rest of it, I think has been really illuminating in a way, and has probably given you the confidence also to do what you've done. I think really wonderful. Thank you. And Meg, thank you for answering all my questions and so wonderfully with all your colleagues as well. I think that's it just sounds like a really lovely place, and how lovely that the volunteers feel so well regarded. I think volunteers often, are sometimes taken for granted, aren't they?
I don't think we are at all.
No, it doesn't sound like it. Cake. is just ace, isn't it? So thank you both very much indeed for a wonderful evening.